We had this linear growth assumption, and then it just stayed flat and it wasn't moving, and we couldn't budge above 2 million. We moved from this being a concern to this being an existential crisis. The platform is going to be shut down if it doesn't get closer to washing its own face. And at that moment, yeah, we really had to pivot.
Hello and welcome to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy series, where we're joined by leading operators and founders in edtech to share practical advice and guidance for early stage founders. If you're building the future of learning and work, then this is for you. I'm Zara and I'm joined by our guest today, Simon Nelson. Simon is CEO of QA Higher Education, a leading provider of higher education services to learners, universities, and employers with a focus on bridging the skills gap. Simon draws on a 25-year career building products and services across media and education that have impacted millions of people worldwide. Before he joined QA, he was the founding CEO of the UK's leading online learning platform, FutureLearn, from launch in 2012 until mid-2020. And over this period, 15 million people had signed up to short courses and degrees on FutureLearn, delivered by the world's top universities. After FutureLearn, he spent a year as Group Digital Director for the world's leading international schools group, Nord Anglia. Simon just celebrated his 2-year anniversary at QA Higher Education, where he has overseen the rapid growth in student numbers, revenues, and profits on behalf of the company and its 7 university partners. I'm excited to jump in. Today, we have a lineup of 3 key topics to discuss. 1, how to monetize edtech products to achieve sustainable growth. 2, navigating sales to educational institutions. And 3, how to approach fundraising. And if you're successful, how to then manage your investors. Let's jump into the first topic. Simon, FutureLearn has had a pretty incredible journey with a lot of learnings along the way, from entering the world of MOOCs to offering full online degrees, culminating in a 100 million valuation when its owners, the Open University, sold 50% of it to the Seek Group. Can you talk us through this journey at FutureLearn and all the different stages you went through?
Yeah, absolutely. It was an incredible ride, really, from the moment back in 2012 when I was introduced to the Vice Chancellor of the Open University, the world leader in distance and online learning. And the Vice Chancellor asked me if I wanted to launch a British response to MOOCs. And Coursera and edX, players who were already out there in the market. So I said yes, not quite knowing what I was getting into, but then faced this headlong rush to get into a market we were already way behind in, albeit with extremely generous funding, which was a fantastic position to be in. We managed to get a very high quality platform launched within 9 months. I built an absolutely amazing team. I was so lucky with some of the people I was able to find and secure. And we had a fantastic team culture there. It was a very circuitous route, but quite quickly we managed to get significant learner growth and at some stages phenomenal upsurges. We had individual courses that were reaching hundreds of thousands of people in a few weeks. So we had these fantastic surges of growth. And then all the way along, however, we had the kind of growing need to monetize and aim towards sustainability. And that also took many fluctuations. I'd love to say there was a clear linear path that we followed, grounded in clear strategy at the beginning, but I would be lying if I said that. But ultimately, we got quite a high degree of success and were able to bring in a new investor at a very good valuation. And then a year later, COVID hit. And really, the company was fantastically well positioned for everything that COVID was driving across edtech. Now, my time with the company ended during that period. But yeah, I think hopefully I've got some stories to share, some insights to give on how to drive growth and how to approach monetization for an edtech company.
What an amazing story, and building such a platform in just 9 months is incredible. Would love to hear a little bit more about those periods of growth, because you have a particularly interesting story with FutureLearn. It's a great example that often growth isn't linear and you have to manage those different periods. So how did you think about growth and monetization while at FutureLearn?
So what was interesting in the early days was the deadlines were so crazy the ambition's so high and some of the hype around MOOCs so great that it was really hard to cut through all the noise and work out what were the things we needed to prioritize. But I'd say we were always juggling three things: investment in quality, investment in learner growth, and monetization. And at the beginning, we kind of agreed with the Open University that the most important thing was quality. So we had to launch a quality platform that would differentiate us from other players in the market and in no way undermine the Open University's brand. And again, when you look back, I think it might be really easy to prioritize monetization from the beginning or audience growth, learner growth. But actually, the thing that really ultimately drove that 100 million valuation was the investment in a quality platform. And we definitely got that right. And by being able to pull together this fantastic team from the Open University, ex-VC people, other people that were in and around my network in those years, we put something out in the market super fast that I think we could pretty quickly point at and say that's one of the best learning platforms in the world, and definitely doing learning at scale. So then we've got this great platform though, but the numbers are nowhere near what Coursera are boasting about, edX are boasting about, what our university partners have been led to expect. And so, okay, we've got to now focus much more on marketing and driving learner growth and getting us to a much higher level, a much higher impact in terms of a global learning player. And a lot of that was investment in getting the right content, developing the platform in order to drive greater organic growth, lots of successful and failed attempts to use paid marketing, etc. And ultimately, though, a lot of success coming. Ultimately, it came down to the courses, really. When the British Council launched a course on preparation to IELTS, that was the one that attracted hundreds of thousands of people. Suddenly, boom, we've gone from this level to this level. But then quite quickly, it's apparent we've got a great platform, we've got numbers coming in, we're spending a fortune servicing that. So what are our first attempts at monetization? And I think for all of the MOOC players in those early days, we were all assuming that we would be able to monetize a proportion of the very large numbers of free learners we were getting. And a lot of platform development, a lot of the team's focus then had to switch onto monetization. But we were always balancing it against growth and quality, etc. And we limped along to our first 2 million of revenue in the first couple of years or so. We did our modeling though, and we said, okay, if we extrapolate this forward, then that 2 million is going to turn into 10 million, going to turn into 20 million. And we had this linear growth assumption. And then it just stayed flat and it wasn't moving and we couldn't budge above 2 million. And so actually what then happened was our owner and shareholder, the Open University, leadership changed there. And actually we moved from this being a concern to this being an existential crisis. The platform is going to be shut down if it doesn't get closer to washing its own face. And at that moment, we really had to pivot. And one of the key things we did was we had to go to the universities who are our partners and who previously we had said, we'll give you the platform for free if you give us courses on it. And we had to say to them, it's not working. And it's not working partly because you're not giving us the courses that will monetize. We were getting amazing courses driven from universities' research priorities. We were not getting business and finance courses and AI courses and the stuff that we felt we could monetize. So we told the universities we're going to have to start charging them. But in return for charging them for the platform, we were going to develop it in certain ways that they would want. And you know what? That probably the biggest lesson for me, because I was really nervous about going to these vice chancellors of universities and saying, I've got to start charging you. And what kept coming back at me was, okay, actually, you don't value what you don't pay for. So in fact, if we're paying for it, but it's going to be heading in the directions you're talking about, then we're more comfortable than if it's free. And that was a real lesson to me. People don't value free as much as you think. And actually, only one university out of like dozens dropped out because of that payment element. all of the rest paid. And suddenly we had 3 million revenue coming in straight to hitting costs. And it was a fantastic step change. And at the same time, other stuff that we've been nurturing, like a move into fully paid courses and fully online degrees, which would obviously be paid for, these came to fruition. And so rather than going linear 2 to 10 million, we were at 2 million. We were within 6 months of getting the chop. And then a year later, we were at 6 million, and a year after that, 8 million. And if I look back on it, I and the team had to be jolted out of the path we were on in order to drive that. Now, one other aspect I'd say to this that I suspect a lot of edtech firms may face is that was really problematic for a lot of our staff, because we'd hired a lot of people and we'd made our mission and our public statements about transforming access to education. And we were delivering amazing, powerful, free learning to people all over the world who'd never had access to it before. And we'd been very overt about that mission, internally, externally, made us all feel fantastic about who we work for. But some people found it then really difficult to say, but we're going to start charging people, or we're going to start charging some people, or we're not going to invest in the free stuff. We're going to just be investing in the paid stuff, or we're not going to be investing in quality. We're investing in these new monetization tools. And I guess if I had my time again, from the very beginning, I would be being much, much clearer about the fact we were a commercial organization, wholly owned by a not-for-profit, but expected to deliver to sustainability and then profit in the long term. And I would have been clearer at hiring. I would have been clearer in all of my staff speeches, external speeches, etc., because it was so hard culturally to pivot the organization later on. And I suspect even now, like years after I've gone, those debates still rage, and I suspect they're raging a lot of edtech companies. And I'd really encourage founders, CEOs, leadership teams to be really overt and upfront, because ultimately someone has to pay. If you're a charity or a not-for-profit, you may be able to do that without access to commercial revenue, but otherwise, there is not going to be an unlimited checkbook from your shareholders or investors.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Simon. It's really interesting, the dichotomy of profit and purpose you touched on, because a lot of edtech founders struggle with this when they're very mission driven. But at the end of the day, to be able to scale, you need to have profit to reinvest into the business. And so a lot of lessons there. I'd be interested to know, you touched on a couple of these as you describe FutureLearn's journey, but what are the one or two things that you see startups most often get wrong when it comes to commercializing edtech products, that if they could understand from day one, it would save them the headache of having to pivot down the line?
One of the things that me and Bern does, and Bern our investors, was it's very easy to look at the first examples of something that are successful and extrapolate from there. In the early days, we introduced our first paid certificates on a few courses. So we only had a few courses. We had about 30, 40 courses by this stage. By the end, we had 1,000 by the time I left. I can't remember what those first courses were, but when we offered people a chance to buy a certificate at the end of the course, 2, 3, 4% of people did. So we go back to our projections and go, okay, let's say therefore we're going to 10x the number of courses. Each one of them is going to have this 2, 3%. Happy days. The numbers look really healthy for the future. And that was the story we sold to our investors, and our investors, it was a very plausible story. But what then happened was, when you had 100 courses, not 40, they did not behave the same way as those first 40. And part of the reason was those first 40 were the flagship courses for many of our universities. They were the first ones they were doing. They were the ones that put loads of effort and PR behind, and the academics really cared for them and nurtured the communities that were building up in them. They were much higher quality experiences than then the second, third, or fourth run of that course, or the second, third, or fourth course that was coming out of that university, by which stage the whole university was getting a little bored of the whole MOOC story or whatever. But also, those first courses, you picked them for a reason. They're your real bankers. And I've seen it. I've operated as a consultant at various points since being at FutureLearn, before I started at QA as well. And I've seen people doing it, and I've seen them do that. This first course has been brilliant. So therefore, here's the linear growth curve that comes after it. Beware, because just try and anticipate what the dynamics of real scale are, because they'll be very different to the early days.
Is there a magic number or a particular point at which can be safer to extrapolate?
I think founders can use data in probably much more sophisticated ways than I was all the way through the journey. You just got to be realistic. In the early days, you're looking at very sparse amounts of data. And so you're having to make fairly wild assumptions from it. So just try and be honest with yourself about leaving a variety of scenarios that could flow from that very small sample size you're starting with. And then be rigorous about checking in and testing your assumptions as they're changing. And it wasn't just us who did this. I saw our investors come in and just apply a playbook and go, oh yeah, we've seen this happen in other companies, it's going to do this and this. And it's really persuasive. You're like, oh, okay, that's fantastic. We're going to get swept along in this tech playbook. It doesn't happen, or it didn't happen. I guess applying that dose of pragmatism, reality as well, and operational nous to the data, finding the right balance.
That's great advice, being very honest with yourself and your team about expectations and leaving room for a variety of scenarios that we then pressure test. I would love to go a level deeper on this topic of monetization because, as you said, it can be a particularly difficult topic for edtech founders selling into educational institutions. And you experienced that pivot of giving educational institutions a product for free and then having to charge them later on. Given your broad experiences with FutureLearn, with QA, Nord Anglia, I'd love to really peel back the curtain on the procurement process. What was the process like for deciding whether or not to adopt a new edtech solution? What influenced those decisions?
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess for the last 3 years, 1 year at Nord Anglia and 2 years now at QA, I have been poacher turned gamekeeper. As a CEO in one of these roles, you do get a pretty good sense of what not to do. So personally, any cold calling, any email ad campaign is going to get immediately binned. And however desperate or imaginative the ways to capture my attention are, it's not the way in. All of the people who've got traction with us, with me as an individual and the companies I've run, have come through some sort of personal connection. Now, I'm not saying that's nepotistic, so only my friends can get access, but it's like people who smartly identify connections and find ways for connections to connect with us are the ones that are more likely to get a hearing. And I guess so I'd say that introduction is critical. And so if you haven't got a decent advisory board or investors or mentors on whom you can lean to get some of these connections, then I'd suggest you need to find them. It's also then about getting to the right level in the organization. So a lot of organizations will try and come to me. That's fine, but it means an extra meeting. I'm only going to pass it on to the next person who actually will be the decision maker or more likely to have some expertise. So thinking carefully about that and when to go high up. And sometimes that is the right way. When we were launching FutureLearn, the reason we got such traction so early, we managed to sign up 20 of the top 40 UK universities within about a couple of months. And the reason for that was the Vice Chancellor of the OU was an amazing networker. He was a peer of the Vice Chancellors of those universities. He had the British government universities minister right alongside him backing what we were doing. We had fantastic entry, and then that opened doors. It's not always right. Sometimes that approach will wind up people lower down and go, hold on a minute, you're trying to go above my head in order to get something done. But then I'd also say, once you get in that meeting, it's absolutely obvious stuff. But we made these mistakes all the time at FutureLearn. Going in slightly ill-prepared or without a very clear pitch, you just got to put yourself in the shoes of that person. They are probably busy as hell, stressed as hell, thinking about a dozen other things. They've taken the meeting possibly as a favor, possibly it's not the most important thing they're doing that day. So you've got to make it really easy for them. You've got to be like, the reason I'm here, my identification of your problem is this. The solution I've got to that is this. I would like to follow up by doing this. And in order to help you do that, I will send you materials that you can just hit forward on, or you can do X with. And then, because I know you're a busy person, I'm going to follow up in a reasonably sophisticated but insistent way over the next few days, weeks, months, depending on your level of appetite. So I'm sure there is a business development casebook or a sales casebook that is far more sophisticated than what I've just said. But for being on both sides of the fence, that's what good looks like to me.
Really helpful. Firstly, avoiding the cold calls and email ad campaigns. Secondly, really investing in growing your network, whether it's, as you said, through advisors, mentors, investors, so that they can make those really valuable introductions and getting to the right level of decision maker. And then finally, making sure that when you're in that pitch, it might be the most important thing you have on that day, but remembering that might not be the case for the other person and making it as easy as possible for them to process that information and take the next step.
One other point I would add, as I think about it, when I was speaking at or attending conferences, I was always far more open-minded and available for more creative discussions with other companies, other individuals, etc. There's a reason those things exist. There's a reason they're so successfully navigating a post-COVID world. And yeah, if you can get in those environments, they're great opportunities to connect in a different way with someone who's in a different mindset than when they're sat at their desk or running from one meeting to another.
Absolutely. Everyone at ASU GSV is enjoying the sunshine in San Diego, so it's a very different vibe to being in your office on calls back to back. Touching on that, are there any specific conferences that you recommend that you would advise founders to look into?
You've named ASU GSV, which I think is probably the best edtech conference I've ever been to. If you can get yourself to there. I think edtech X in London, and there's various spin-offs of it, I think is a really good UK equivalent. One of the things we got really good at FutureLearn was running our own conferences for our own partners and prospective partners. And I'd say it became one of the things that the universities and the people we work with valued most about the relationship. And we worked hard to make them not just sales events, but workshops where people came together, worked together, collaborated together on things that weren't purely on our agenda. So they became really good business development opportunities for us.
A great example there of really investing in the quality again, rather than trying to get straight to the growth or monetization, even when you were looking at prospective partners. So moving on to our final topic of today, monetizing an edtech company is really hard. But building sustainable traction, as we've covered, is even harder. And sometimes it's just impossible without outside capital. Fundraising played a critical role at FutureLearn. Can you talk us through FutureLearn's fundraising journey?
Definitely. And it was very unusual, and so therefore probably not a model for many. So what was unique about it was the Open University as an investor in those early years. Open University, not-for-profit, British university, world leader distance and online learning, but watching the arrival of MOOCs as something of a threat, being challenged by the British government to say, come on, you're meant to be our UK's innovation story. Why aren't you getting involved in this? And also watching UK universities signing up with American platforms and saying, come on, Open University, can't we play in this? And finally, looking at the quality of MOOCs at that time and going, surely, with the Open University's expertise, we can do something better here. So they gave us incredibly generous funding. So £15 million to get out of the blocks. And then within a few years, backed by these early, really exciting numbers and growth projections, another £15 million. And then as an investor, a lot of the early vision and drive was led by some really visionary people at the Open University, including their Vice Chancellor, Martin Bean, and a Professor of Educational Technology there, called Mike Sharples, and some of the other leaderships. But as a shareholder also, they were reasonably benign. They were not on my back every day. They were very trusting. They allowed us to do things and set ourselves up in a way that challenged their own organization. However, they were then being owned by a public institution like that has its own challenges. So when there were changes of leadership, you could get a very different style of involvement of the shareholder and so on. And yeah, some of the fluctuations over the years were driven by the existential crises, etc., came from those changes of leadership, changes of approach, changes of strategy. And they were quite hard to predict sometimes and quite hard to navigate. But eventually, I think they realized or were happy that they had a real success on their hands. But we needed to convince them that if we were going to continue to grow, we needed to bring in a new investor, because to keep pace with the Coursera, edX, etc., was going to take a lot more money. To build on the foundations we'd started was going to take a lot more investment. And there was no longer the appetite at the OU to keep using its own money, its own public money, in order to do that. And I kind of respect that decision. I think that was a right call. So we started a process, and the process took a year to bring in a new investor. And we had a fairly traditional process managed by an investment advisory firm. They were outstanding, called IBIS, and they are actually the people who run the edtech conference, for example. And it was the first time I'd been through one of those processes. We were quite high profile, as you can imagine, and they really expertly managed the prospectus, the flyer going out to 120 companies, more in depth, and going out to 30, management presentations to 12, and then narrowed down to a smaller kind of finalization of 2 or 3. And through that process, what kept me sane through it all was I always felt I'm never going to bullshit. I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I don't know. I'll be upfront about where the challenges in the company are. I'll be bullish about our successes. It's a philosophy I've got anyway in business. Meant no one could throw a difficult question at me that would really pull the rug from under me, because I'd just say, I don't know. We'll find out. If they were challenging me on something really difficult in our numbers, no bullshit at no stage. So I wasn't trying to think up what I'd said last time or whatever, always playing a straight bat. So yeah, Seek came in, they bought 50% of the company for £50 million, which was invested directly into the company. I was then there for about another year. Ultimately, myself and the investors parted company. That was a few months into COVID, when the company was seeing very rapid acceleration across all its metrics. I think there was differences of opinion over how far and how fast we could and should be going.
What advice would you give to early stage founders approaching fundraising for the very first time? Maybe, let's say, with VCs, because OU was a very unique arrangement. But if you could perhaps share 3 of the most important elements for fostering a really healthy relationship with investors.
Sure. I'd say 3 things. Try and be super straight from the outset. Don't bullshit. It will get found out at some point in the process, or it'll come back to bite you some other time, or it'll make the whole thing a lot more stressful. Just be super straight. You're going to have to go on a journey with these investors through the good and the bad times, and start off from a foundation of transparency, openness, integrity, and I think that'll take you a long way. Linked to that is be super clear and try not to fudge disagreements or let things go that are unclear. I'll give you an example. With one of my investors, I thought we had agreed one thing at one stage. They thought we'd agreed something else. Neither of us had written it down. Each of us, because it was a difficult conversation, moved on from it. We'll tackle that later on. And actually then when it came out later, it was quite a massive difference between us when the pressure was really on. And there was no record, no documentation. There was a lot of emotion and passion that was generated, therefore, between I said this, you said that, which was all pretty futile, really. It may not be in your nature. It wasn't in my nature to document and minute and be really rigid and structured in comms, decision making, etc. It's bloody helpful if you can do it, though, as a record to fall back on for both of you. And then I guess the final thing is life's going to be a hell of a lot easier if you're hitting your numbers. So therefore, be really careful about being too ambitious or inflating your numbers, frankly, to attract or please an investor. An investor's always going to ask you to do an extra 10%, extra 20%, or what can it take, or what would you have to believe? That's a classic one. In order to do this, you would have to believe this. And before you know it, those are enshrined as targets. And then when you miss those targets, you signed up to these targets and you're trying to rein back and say, yeah, but remember all the contextualization we put around it, etc. You've got to be really careful. I've learned that through my career. You sign up to a number, whatever caveats you may put verbally around it, if you sign up to the number, you're going to be held accountable for it. So make sure you really own those numbers.
So firstly, being really upfront and transparent with your investors. Secondly, noting down agreements, particularly around sensitive or perhaps uncomfortable topics. And then finally, being realistic with your numbers rather than inflating them or being too ambitious so that you don't end up in a situation where you're not hitting your numbers later on because they're just so ridiculously high. In the last couple of minutes we have together, we'd love to move into our final part of the session, which is our quick fire round. So I'm going to ask you a quick question and you respond with a one-line response. You ready?
Yeah, go.
What is the favorite question you ask when you hire people and why?
I think you get much more interesting answers and insights when people talk about what went wrong in their careers rather than what went right.
What is the most important leadership quality you've embraced as a CEO and how has it helped shape your team?
Just trying to free myself up to have more time to stand back and give an overview, stay a bit calmer, not get pulled down too far into the weeds so that you can help pull people out of the weeds. I would say that's how I operate, and hopefully that adds value to the people who work for me.
What habit or routine do you credit most with your personal or professional development?
Quite early in my career, I was a bit of a firebrand. I used to go around shouting at people, being really difficult in meetings, and a very good boss I had at the BBC told me that I had to get a coach, and she got me a very good coach. And I resisted that person's coaching for quite a while because it was quite challenging to me. But eventually she got through. I ended up working with her for probably 15 years in one way or another, and I still have coaches and mentors that I go to on quite a regular basis. It's absolutely invaluable for me, and I would not have had anything like the career I've had without those opportunities to step back and do some often fairly brutal self-analysis with someone I trust.
Thank you so much for sharing those incredible insights, Simon, particularly for being so open and transparent about what went well, but equally as importantly, what didn't go so well. And I'm sure these will be really helpful to all the founders and operators tuning in. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of that with us.
Thanks a lot, Sarah.
Thanks for listening to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, follow our channel, and if you're feeling generous, share it with a friend.